Hi everyone. I'm going to do just a really quick video lecture here about personality testing, which is something I do in my job on a pretty regular basis. Um, Hopefully you've read through parts of this chapter already, looking at the different approaches to personality. I'm just going to be talking only about how we assess personality as psychologists. So there are some really basic things you could do to try and look at somebody's personality. You could look at their life outcomes, like uh, their level of education, their level of income, their marital status, and that might tell you something about their personality. You could look at, you could have some kind of situational test where we observe behavior in certain kinds of situations and see how people react. Like that, it reminds me of that show, What Would You Do? Like that could be a measure of someone's personality, what they would do in a strange situation. You could ask people who know you. That's the observer rating. So if I wanted to know about your personality, I could go to your mom or your dad or your siblings and say, "Oh, what do you think of their personality?" And then I could go to your friends and say, "What do you think of their personality?" And they could give me different kinds of information. And all those things are good. Um, I incorporate all those things when I'm doing personality testing, but the problem is they're not always super scientific. Just because someone graduated college and has a high-paying job doesn't mean they're doesn't necessarily tell me anything about their personality. And so what I usually do is have some kind of personality test, a special test um, that uh, will give me some more information. Okay. And in general, there's two kinds of personality tests. The first kind is called a projective personality test. Um, these are tests made up of relatively unstructured stimuli in which the person's response is seen as reflecting some kind of unconscious thought process, like their needs, their fantasies, their conflicts, other things like that. The classic example is the Rorschach ink blot test. Um, so if I was giving you the Rorschach ink blot test, I would show you this card, and I would ask you, tell me what, or what would I say? I would say, what might this be? And you're going to look at this, and you're going to come up with some kind of response. And I have a book in front of me, and there are lots of responses that people usually give, and then there are unusual responses. So looking at this one, sometimes I hear people say, "Oh, that looks like a nuclear bomb going off," or it looks like some kind of a sea creature, like a crab or something. But if I'm giving this to somebody who has some kind of mental illness, they might focus in on like this little white part and say, "Oh, that looks like um, a distant planet," or something like that. That would be kind of an unusual response. And so I don't usually give a lot of these projective personality tests because they take more time. They're difficult for me to score, but they can be beneficial in some situations. If a person has already taken other personality tests, like down here, the MMPI, which I'll talk about, if someone has just recently taken an MMPI, I'm not going to give them that again. I might give them a projective test. Um, Also, if you have someone who you think is trying to trick you and act a certain way, so like criminals do this when I work with criminals, they may want to make themselves look really good. And so if I give them a projective test that is like an ink blot, it's much more difficult for them to figure out how to look good because they aren't sure what the right answers are. So those might be situations that I might do that. What I use more frequently is a non-projective personality test. These are tests that have clear, specific questions or statements, and people are asked to respond to them. And they're usually completed in either a true-false format or a multiple choice format. And then I can compare you against other people in your age group. Okay, so the one I use the most is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or the MMPI. Um, the most recent version has 338 true-false questions. Okay, so and the first one is I like mechanics magazines, true or false? Okay, so it's those kinds of questions. And if you take that test, what I'll get is a graph that looks something like this. And there's all these different scales that measure different things. And so, like, for example, scale 8 here is the schizophrenia scale. And so here we have two different people that took it, and I'm really looking at scores above this line. So my green person here is below that line on schizophrenia. There's probably not a lot of concerns there, but this person is way up there. And so that's a little concerning. And then I look over here at scale 4, which is paranoia, and that one's high. I might have a paranoid schizophrenic on my hands, and that will tell me something about how their personality functions. So that's the kind of test I usually use. I think on the next exam there's a question about this. Some companies will use personality tests to help them guide hiring decisions. Not all of them, though. The U.S. federal government has banned this practice. They don't do this kind of thing. And the reason they don't is that personality tests measure things that are too general to predict how someone might do in a specific job. So your personality traits may influence your performance in some jobs, but not others. It may predict how you would do in certain situations and not others. And there's also lots of concerns about privacy. So if I'm working for Microsoft and they give me an MMPI, but 2 years later I decide to leave and go somewhere else, well, what happens to my MMPI score? Do they keep it? Who do they share it with? There are a lot of concerns about that, about how that stuff could be used in the future. And so that's a practice that most companies have shied away from, but there's probably still a few out there that do it. So that's going to be all I talk about in this lecture. And thank you for listening.